Hello, this is QM, short for Quentin MacLeod, and this video we'll be talking about why Nintendo should not go third party. Now, my previous video entitled Nintendo Should Go Third Party was basically me explaining why Nintendo won't go third party, despite what people want, but that didn't convince people. People still are rallying for Nintendo to go third party. And the problem with Nintendo going third party is it's a really, really bad idea for them to go third party. As a matter of fact, I believe it's hurtful to the industry for Nintendo to go in that direction. As a matter of fact, I was reading up on how I guess the former president of THQ, he was also the co-founder of a Naughty Dog like over a decade ago or something like that. And he was clamoring for Nintendo to release their games on other systems. And people, if you just take a look at what this guy has done to THQ, and go back and just think to yourself, why isn't he at Naughty Dog anymore? Just think. The guy was the president of THQ. THQ went under. In my eyes, anyone who was a president or CEO of a company that has failed do not have a say in anything. No one should be listening to these people because, you wouldn't listen to a crackhead when it comes to drugs. You just wouldn't. You wouldn't listen to a person like that. And here's why you wouldn't want to listen to this guy. Here's why Nintendo should not go third party. I just want to put a few requisites out there first. If Nintendo were to go third party, everyone knows that Nintendo prefers to have their software revolve around hardware. So chances are, if Nintendo went third party, they would want their games exclusive to one particular piece of hardware. That's just based on how they develop their games. It's always usually around a particular set of hardware. Now, knowing Nintendo, Nintendo has a more desirable relationship with Sony than they would with Microsoft, probably partially because Sony is a Japanese company, but Nintendo will probably most likely go develop games for Sony if they went third party. But here's the problem. It would no longer be, if Nintendo was to go and make exclusive games for Sony, it would no longer be Sony versus Microsoft, because people will think, oh well, Nintendo's out of the console race, it's just two manufacturers, Sony and Microsoft. But that's not the case. It's not Sony and Microsoft anymore. It's Sony and Nintendo versus Microsoft. And here's the problem. Now, of course, gamers would love this, but for third parties, this would be a nightmare for third-party developers and publishers, mainly because, okay, you'll have Sony releasing their first-party and second-party titles. So you'll have your Killzone, you're gonna have your Sly Coopers, your Ratchet and Clanks. You're gonna have those games, your Gran Turismos. But on top of that, you're gonna have your Marios, your Zeldas, Donkey Kongs, Metroids, all on one system. Now this sounds like music to a gamer's ears. But the thing about that is Nintendo's games, they of course sell tens of millions of copies. They're really big games. And third parties will have to compete with that. And you could say, well, they compete with Nintendo now on their own systems. Well, this is kind of true, but the thing about Nintendo is they have to, they're a console manufacturer, so they have to court third parties in such a way that they leave room for third parties to release their games so they do not get overshadowed. But if Nintendo becomes third party, they would have no incentive to do this. Since they would no longer need to court third parties, they would just release games whenever they wanted. So you'd be looking at not just one or two big games being released either monthly or even bi-monthly. You'd be seeing several games being released. You'd be seeing bam, Zelda, bam, 3D Mario, then bam, F-Zero, bam, Star Fox. And on top of Gran Turismo and Ratchet and Clank and Killzone and all of Sony's first-party titles, the smaller developers will have their games completely overshadowed. It's like releasing a Grand Theft Auto 5 every month on Sony consoles. Those third parties will not be able to compete with that. Therefore, their sales will hurt a lot. And it isn't just limited to that. I mean, if third parties see that they can't compete with Sony's and Nintendo's first-party titles, they may move to Microsoft. But that will basically tear the industry in half, because then you will have this mega console by Sony, which is dishing out both Sony and Nintendo games, and then you have Microsoft, who barely has any first-party exclusive games. They'll have their third-party titles, and then it'll basically be the same industry as you've seen before. And of course, that would be a problem, because if anything, if the gamer wants to take advantage of strong first-party support, they'd still have to get a Sony console. And then, of course, if they want to play their third-party games, they'd still have to get a Microsoft console. But even so, I mean, if you look at it, if Sony were to acquire Nintendo games, Sony wouldn't only just have their own fan base, they'd have the Nintendo fan base as well. That would, well, their user base would increase astronomically. Sony would have a lot of sales. It just would not be fair. It just wouldn't be fair at all. Now, let's say Nintendo doesn't produce games exclusively to Sony systems. Let's say they make games for Microsoft and Sony. That's still a big problem. One is because Nintendo would have a lot of political pull. Now, the problem with third parties now on Nintendo's consoles is that they don't really have a whole lot of political pull with Nintendo. You know, they cannot really move Nintendo in regards, or move Nintendo in a way that they can with Sony and Microsoft. You know, they can make suggestions to Sony and Microsoft on how the consoles should be built, or they can ask for, for Sony and Microsoft to give them money for exclusive rights for a couple of months, or for DLC, things like that. They don't have that with Nintendo. But if Nintendo goes third party and makes games for both consoles, Sony and Microsoft, the amount of political clout they would have would be enormous. Because, as you know, Nintendo is the largest they're not third party, but they're the largest video game publisher in the world. They're bigger than EA. So, if you take a look at this, Nintendo was, of course, to make games for Microsoft and Sony, which I've said. Nintendo's word over another developer's would be that much greater. For example, let's say a third-party developer wants a particular change on a system. Let's say Sony's building a system and they're asking third parties what they want. Sony would take Nintendo's word over theirs. Nintendo's voice will be louder than the smaller third-party devs, because they would have that much political clout, especially if Nintendo can dictate which systems are going to get their games. With that said, Nintendo, or I should say Microsoft and Sony, are going to be fighting each other for these games, spending millions of dollars to Nintendo to either try to get exclusive right to a game or something. They're going to want these games because these games sell tens of millions of copies. So these companies, Sony and Microsoft, at least their video game divisions, are losing a lot of money. They can't really afford that right now. But with the competition with each other, they wouldn't have much of a choice if they want Nintendo's games. So because of that, Nintendo would have that much more political pull over everyone else, which is bad because it means that the third party would have even less of a voice, even less political pull than they would now with Sony and Microsoft. But of course, it doesn't stop there. Now, as I was saying earlier, Nintendo has to court third parties on their system. So they would leave release gaps in which third parties could release games, so they wouldn't have to compete with Nintendo's games. But without Nintendo having a system, without them needing to court third parties, they could release their games whenever they wanted. That's also an issue. And it wouldn't be just on one system, it would be on both. So third-party companies would not be able to compete with heavy hitters such as Zelda, Mario, Metroid, and games like that. They would not be able to compete. So what will end up happening is a lot of these third parties will either lose money, get gobbled up, or they will die. Even more so than they have last generation. And at that stage, the industry will be all about the big dogs. It'll be about the big publishers, because the smaller publishers would not stand a chance. How would a smaller publisher be able to compete with big blockbuster games from EA, Activision, and Rockstar? Or Take-Two, I should say. How would they be able to compete with those types of big blockbuster games? They wouldn't be able to. I mean, if you think about it, what would you rather buy? Would you rather buy a unnamed third-party shooter or first-party shooter, or would you rather get the new Zelda? Or would you rather get a racing game, a racing game by a smaller third party, or F-Zero? I mean, these games completely overshadow anything these smaller third-party developers or even publishers could come up with. It will completely hurt the industry because it will push out the little guy, and it will just be titans fighting each other for the same space. It's that bad. That's just by Nintendo going third party. It's just toxic. It's not a good idea for Nintendo to go third party because it would cause a rift through the industry. Sure, it sounds great to a gamer, but to third parties and even to the other two console manufacturers, it would be a death sentence on all of them.